and devices are typically configured with a single IP address for a default gateway. And if the default gateway address cannot be reached, the local device is unable to send packets off the network. So router redundancy. To prevent a single point of failure at the default gateway, implement a virtual router. Present the illusion of a single router to the host of on the LAN, and by sharing an IP address and a MAC address, two or more routers can act as a single virtual router. IPv4 address of virtual router is configured as the default gateway for the workstation of a specific IPv4 segment. ARP resolution returns the MAC address of the virtual router. And physical router that forwards traffic transparent to the host device. Router redundancy protocol provide the mechanism for determining which router should take an active role in forwarding traffic. Ability of a network to dynamically recover from the failure of a device acting as a default gateway is known as first hop redundancy. So these are the steps for router failover. So when the active router fails, the redundancy protocol transition the standby router to the new active router. So the standby router stops seeing hello messages from the forwarding router. Standby router assumes the role of the forwarding router. So it will become the forwarding router. And because the new forwarding router assumes both the IPv4 and MAC addresses of the virtual router, the host device see no disruption in service. So the host device will not know that there is a problem with the router because the forwarding router assumes what the first one got. So it assumes both IPv4 and MAC address, so the host device will not see any disruption at all. So hot standby router protocol or HRSRP, it is a Cisco proprietary FHRP designed to allow for transparent failover of a first hop IPv4 device. So the functions of HSRP standby router is to monitor the operational status of the HSRP group and quickly assume packet forwarding responsibility if the active router fails. So as HSRP for IPv6, this is Cisco proprietary FHRP providing the same functionality of HSRP but in a V6 environment. So Visual Router Redundancy Protocol version 2, it is a non-proprietary protocol that dynamically assigns responsibility for one or more virtual routers to the VRRP routers of IPv4. So VRRP v3 capability to support IPv4 and IPv6. Gateway Load Balancing Protocol or GLBP, it protects data traffic from a failed router or circuit allowing load balancing between a group of redundant routers. Overview of HSRP. One router is selected by HSRP to be an active router and a default gateway. So if that happens, the other routers will be the standby router. And if an active router fails, standby assumes the role of the active router and the default gateway. The hosts are configured with single default gateway addresses. So if something happens, the host will not recognize if they are still using the same router because it is not recognizable by both active and standby routers. So these are the HSRP versions. We have group members, multicast address, virtual MAC address, support for MDS authentication. So we have version 1, version 2 for HSRP. You can see in priority and preemption of HSRP, the role of active and standby routers determined by election process. By default, the router with the numerically highest IPv4 address will be elected as the active router. Control HSRP election with priority and do not use highest address. The HSRP priority used to determine active router. The default HSRP priority is 100, range is 0 to 255, and router with highest priority will become active. You can use the standby priority interface command to check this one. So, HSRP preemption. Preemption is an ability of HSRP to trigger the re-election process. So, if something the election, it can trigger to process an election again. To force a new HSRP election process, preemption must be enabled using a standby preempt interface. A router that comes online with a high priority will become the active router. So here are the SHRP states and timers. So if it's initial, it is entered through a configuration change or when an interface first became available. So initial, the first time. Learn. The router has not determined the virtual IP address and has not yet seen a hello message from the active router. The router waits to hear from the active router. Listen. The router knows the virtual IP address, but the router is neither the active router nor the standby router. It just listens to hello messages from those routers. Speak. The router sends periodic hello messages and active participates in the election of active and standby router. Standby. It is a candidate to become the next active router and send periodic hello messages. And lastly, active. The router currently forwards packets that are sent to the group virtual MAC address and the router sends periodic hello messages. So it sends hello messages every 3 seconds by default, and the standby router will become active if it doesn't receive a hello message from the active router after 10 seconds. So you can lower those timer settings to speed up the failover or preemption. However, to avoid increased CPU usage and unnecessary standby state changes, do not set the hello timer to 1 second or hold time for 10 seconds. So these are the HSRP configuration commands. You can see in its definition. This is a HSRP sample configuration, verification, HSRP failure, failing to successfully elect